funded studies. She serves on the editorial board for Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine, Evidence-Based Integrated Medicine, and Journal of Vortex Science and Technology. She's an adjunct professor at several universities, including CITES here, and maintains a holistic health practice advising clients on enhanced self-care. And to our great benefit here at CITES, she's been involved with this school since basically its founding, right? And by the way, yesterday we had the person who initially coined the term subtle energies speaking here, Dr. Tiller, and I believe Dr. Rubik is one of the first to use, or at least bring into the fore, the term biofield. So we're very lucky to have her speaking here today.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I have some handouts, and I wonder if somebody could help me to pass these out. It's just a one sheet, and it's your take-home lesson for the practical part of my lecture. Thank you so much. My goal today is to cover essentially two topics. One is healthful drinking water in relationship to subtle energy content, memory of water, etc., as well as evidence that I've found and evidence from the literature. There's a lot of functional waters out there, and people often ask me, what should I drink? What's the best water? What about this new water in the market? And it's getting more and more confusing with more functional waters out there. But you have to ask yourself, what is the science behind those waters? What is the shelf life of something in a bottle? Water is very impressionable, as you'll see. And even though somebody claims to imbue it with subtle energies, we don't really know how they last in that bottle, especially when given the sea of the wireless world in which we live. Impinging on that, all of those communication frequencies from radio frequency to 60 hertz and everything else. We don't have a clue how that interacts with anything that we put in our bodies as well. So that's one thing today. And the other is to tell you more, update you about the memory of water and some of the really exciting studies going on at the cutting edge of science by some others, as well as a couple of things by myself. So those are my purposes today. So water is one of the most beautiful things in this world in terms of the many forms it takes. Always in motion, impressionable, and the essence of life on Earth. Some 70% of our Earth, at least at the surface, is water. And it's interesting to note that also the composition of life is about 70% water or more. We are the water planet. There's no other planet that we know of, or moon on Jupiter or Saturn, that has as much water in a liquid state as Earth. And although water probably is ubiquitous throughout the universe, we may expect to find other life forms, hopefully. I like the term matrix of life that was actually coined by St. Georgi, and he was a Nobel laureate in physics, and he went on to talk about an energy aspect of life, actually. He was looking at electronic properties of proteins. It was very exciting toward the end of his life. I remember hearing him lecture in the 1970s. He's no longer with us. But his concept of the matrix of life goes all the way back to 16th century, Paracelsus. And by that, they didn't just mean some inert substrate. They meant something literally the mother of life, an active substance that could give life its properties. If you feel the skin of a young infant, you're aware of how supple and smooth and how really fluid life is in infancy. And yet, on our way to old age, we become dry and brittle. We can't move as readily. We feel the aches and pains, and our skin may be dry and wrinkled. What's happened here? The loss of water is the largest biochemical change with aging. Despite all of the attention to telomeres and DNA changes. One cannot deny that we go from over 80% water at birth, and by old age we're under 60%. And nobody understands this. So it's an interesting consequence of aging, the loss of water. If water is the life principle, then we're losing water. Well, then this is a serious loss, and we ought to conduct research and understand how to change it. And that's something that I've been interested in, looking for, shall I say, the fountain of youth, or at least the most healthful water with evidence behind it. So water is essential, but it's largely been ignored. Some 99% of the molecules of the body are water, and yet mainstream science and medicine have been busy looking at the 1%. It seems reminiscent of something else out there, doesn't it? The Occupy Wall Street. The 1% gets all the attention and all the money thrown at it in science, and the 99% is ignored. So water's been marginalized in biology and medicine. It's thought as merely life solvent and a kind of stage or backdrop on which the molecules, serious molecules of life, like DNA and proteins, RNA, membrane lipids, on which they are reacting. But and even today, you see in the literature, X-ray crystallography and models of biomolecules with no attention to the water. Everybody's looking at that 1%. So there are certainly articles in the literature about how water is so essential to our diets and how we are dehydrated. This was an article in the Journal of the American Dietetic Association from 1999, how much water we really need. Men need about 6 pints and women about 4.5 pints, ideally, on a daily basis. And if you drink more water than less, then you lower your risk of things like urinary stone disease, cancer, especially kidney, bladder, breast, and colon, because these are the organs of elimination. And you help your body along by continuing to flush it and maintaining a flow of water. Obesity, many diseases respond to water. Some years ago, about 20 years ago, I met Dr. Van Mangelet, who wrote this book. And I must admit at the time, this was actually around 1990, I thought he was a fanatic. He wrote this book called Your Body's Many Cries for Water. And he was a physician literally prescribing water to people with chronic disease and finding positive results. And this book, he left a legacy. He also has a website, I think it's watercure.com. There it is. You can look at it. As I understand it, it's about maintaining the flow of water in the body. And more recently I began to understand that, and I'll show you some evidence for that in my own work. And so he was a landmark and a frontier thinker who was really ostracized by the medical system, that couldn't imagine how water could be curing chronic disease. But look at all the things water does in the body. Your brain consists of some 90% water. And by the way, when you wake up in the morning, we're all a little bit dehydrated. And the first thing you should drink is about 12 ounces of quality water to rehydrate, because you've lost water simply breathing at night, sleeping. And so we wake up dehydrated, and we need to rehydrate. And that's the first thing we should be doing in the morning, is drinking a big glass of water and waiting about 20 minutes before we eat our breakfast. Water also regulates body temperature. It has a very high specific heat, and by virtue of that, can help you maintain regular body temperature. It's, of course, transporting nutrients in and toxins out. Your blood is about 83% water. Moisturizes the air in our lungs. It's involved in so many metabolic reactions. Either water is split or water is formed. So it's an active participant in most of the biochemistry of the body. Even bone has water in it. Even the driest tissue, bone. And, of course, joint lubrication. These are the things that seem to be affected as people get older. They feel their joints are creaky, not so lubricated, and it protects our organs. But the evidence is increasing that biomolecules are not just sitting on a stage of water doing their thing, but have an intimate relationship with water. And I like to think about it as the yin and the yang of Taoism. So The yang may be considered the biomolecules, and the yin, the water, the feminine element. But here's what Lao Tzu said about water in his famous work. Water is fluid, soft and yielding, but water will wear away rock, which is rigid and cannot yield. As a rule, whatever is fluid, soft, and yielding will overcome whatever is rigid and hard. This is another paradox. What is soft is strong. If we look at forms in biology, so much of them look like movements in water, and just like snapshots of various body forms that critters take on, really reflect the structure of water. Mycelium growth of some algae here, the meandering of a river on Earth. You may say, well, it's not alive, but at a larger scale, it is alive. And the similarity of that to the blood pattern in the body, this is the back view of the retina, the blood vessels. So water never travels in a straight line. There are no straight lines in biology. No organism travels in a straight line. It travels more the way water meanders. And so water is really the essence of life's form, and its motion, and its ultrastructure. And here's an explosion in water, and look how similar that is to the jellyfish, which is 99% water. It looks like a great exuberance within water, just bursting forward, and it propels itself forward along that axis. Now, hydration is especially important for energy medicine. First of all, it detoxifies. Yesterday we walked on the pebble things that we were told to drink because now we've loosened up some toxins in our feet, and that's very important. After energy work, people often release toxins. It's important to drink. But even before diagnosis or measurement in energy medicine, it's very important to be hydrated. And we see that the chi does not flow if someone is not fully hydrated. And so that's obvious. And the meridian conductivity is depressed and can't get accurate readings, but the person is also suffering from poor flows of chi just by sheer dehydration. So Dr. Van Mandelen was right. Now the blood is a liquid tissue. It's the water tissue of the body along with the lymph. I'm going to tell you a little bit about blood because I do something called live blood analysis, which involves taking a fresh sample of blood from the fingertip, placing it on a glass slide, and looking at it under a dark field microscope with video enhancement that gives you a very, very high magnification, several 100,000 power, in fact. And this is a window into the biological terrain. And what is that? That's the soil of the body in which all of your cells are immersed, which is either nourishing them and allowing them to flourish and thrive, or it's thwarting them because it's not clean, because it's like a swamp. And I'll show you just a few pictures from this. So a finger prick is made. It's always done in extremely fresh blood, just taken. And there is healthy, clean blood. There you see the red blood cells. And this is a side illumination under dark field. So the cells appear as round, like circles. And that plasma in the background right up the corner here. I guess this is it. I'm not sure how to work it. Does anybody know how to run this? It's kind of funny. I press it. So anyway, the plasma is, you see, between the cells is the blood plasma, which is, say, is the watery fluid. And that's very important to look at in analyzing biological terrain, as well as the characteristic of blood cells. This is a white blood cell. It's actually I caught it in the act of moving toward 2 o'clock, and it's a polymorphonucleoleucocyte, one of the more common white blood cells in the body. And this blood looks very healthy. This is the blood of a woman in her mid-60s, and it's very unusual to find blood this good in the United States at this time, for various reasons: diet, water, electromagnetic smog, all the ravages of our lives. There are a few platelet aggregates. That's what these are here, and looks like there's a little bit of a distortion here. But by and large, these cells are uniform in size, and they're healthy. This white blood cell is in movement, which is a sign of immune surveillance. and the plasma is clean and clear. That's a far cry from what I'll show you next. This is many people's blood. And the red blood cells are now stuck together because they've lost something called the zeta potential, the net negative charge in the membrane, which causes them to repel one another and flow freely through the microcapillaries of the body. So these are called rouleaux. It's the French word meaning rolls of coins. It's like looking at a roll of nickels on edge. And blood cannot circulate in the peripheral capillaries because they have to go single file. So this is compromised peripheral circulation. On top of that, we see this fibrin, these fibers that have formed here. So this is early clotting, and this is cardiovascular stress. This is a picture of leading to heart attack, stroke, thrombosis, blood clotting in the body, and is the most common feature that we see in people whose blood is aging, but also in young people who eat fast food. Now, and I also say a lot of fats that are quite deteriorated in our diet, the trans fats, even though they're labeled as zero, they're often present. It's just how they define trans fats, which are very inflammatory to our systems. This is another example of blood seen in our society today. It's not quite below, there are a few little stacks, but there are blood cells that are stuck together. Again, the zeta potential, the energetics of the cell has been lost. That is an energy potential in the membrane, and it's not there. So the cells are sticky, and then there's fibrin and also other garbage. I sometimes see even microbes in there. Here's a blow-up of the fibrin. Fibers, which are a clotting protein that appears. And this is what drugs like Coumadin, which are blood-thinning drugs often given to middle-aged and elderly people, are trying to reduce, but at the same time are very difficult to regulate and are quite poisonous and often cause bleeding and death. And here's an example of degeneration. What I just showed you were congested blood, and now this is degenerative blood. This is a person who's taken too many antibiotics. This was a Lyme's disease patient, and these are fungal forms that have now taken over in the blood because we actually have a microbial load in the body. We have 10 times more microbes than human cells. We're colonies. And when we disturb that with long-term antibiotic therapy, then overgrowth of resistant species, whether bacterial or funguses that don't respond to antibiotics, start growing and taking over and totally changing the biological terrain. So this is degeneration. And even blood cells here are giving birth to microbes. Is this focused? I think it could be better focused. Seems to be out of focus. Can somebody focus the projector? I think it's, because this should be clear, at least it is on my computer. If you focus, then I'm going to do this.
Yeah, here's the numbers. Focus on the word focus.
There you go. Is it clear? Okay, it's probably the best you can do there. Okay, now ideally our blood would be like a flowing stream and not a stagnant pool. What I just showed you was an example of stagnant blood, as it may be called in Oriental medicine. Blood is not flowing well. And that is probably one of the, I would say, foremost health problems in civilization that we have for various reasons. What do we drink? That's part of the problem. We drink a lot of things that take us far from physiological pH. Many of the common beverages, from soda pop, coffee, carbonated water, wine, and beer, have pHs that are so far from physiological pH, and yet people sometimes drink these as their main beverage. I had a person come in to a study who this pH of the saliva was 5. Now, it should be about 7. 7.2 to 7.4, which is slightly alkaline, is physiological pH. And when you're that acidic, you're not functional. You're really quite dysfunctional. And she drank, essentially, soda pop for 40 years as her main beverage. So, well, then you expect to be about that pH. But, of course, that's not internal pH. The body will try to maintain physiological pH, but all the fluids in the body, like saliva, will then be diminished. And even tap water, bottled water, are dubious, as we'll see. We are tending to go for bottled water. There's a lot of marketing hype here that this is clean and pure and preferable, but there are plasticizers. The cheapest plastic that yields plasticizers, plastic number 1, if you look at the bottom of the container numbers, you can look that up. All the plastics have a number on the bottom, and then you can look it up and see what it is. And it's not a good plastic, it's not polyethylene, it's the see-through plastic that has marketing appeal, unlike polyethylene that's rather opaque, but it's not good because it's releasing plasticizers that are like phthalates that are linked with cancer. And tap water too. Now they're purifying tap water with substances like chloramine, much stronger than the old chlorine. And chloramine causes respiratory failure in fish. I raise fish, I have 6 tanks, and if I were putting in regular tap water, they would be dead in 10 minutes. In the San Francisco Bay Area, we have a nonprofit group called peopleagainstchloramine.org. These are people suffering from respiratory issues because of chloramine in the water. And it's a stronger purifier against microbes than the old chlorine. You can't boil it off. That's a problem. You have to chemically treat it, or you have to filter it, or do some other maneuver in the water. But you should not be drinking tap water these days anymore. It's simply not safe. The other thing is fluoride. Fluoride was a story told of us that will help with formation of teeth and maintenance of teeth. That's certainly not accurate. It might help young children develop teeth, and after that it's a metabolic poison. And it also has been shown to calcify the pineal gland. Now the pineal gland may be, it's associated with the higher chakras, may be one link up to divinity. So there we go. Removing fluoride is very difficult because it's an extremely tiny ion and very hard to get rid of. We also have a lot of residual chemicals from people dumping their drugs down the toilet or just urinating the drugs that they do take and various metabolites of them. We have a lot of women on hormones for birth control and menopause, and those are entering the water supply, and as you may know, feminizing animals and producing 3-legged frogs, and trace agrochemicals is another issue. And I know my water company, the East Bay Municipal Utility District, has told us they cannot remove the pharmaceutical drugs anymore from our water. They have sent us inserts in our water bills that tell us, your water is contaminated with big pharma. And even if it's not, even if you put on a filter, you may still have the memory of these chemicals that were once in the water, now influencing your health. Now I want to talk about the memory of water. What do I mean by that? I believe that word was coined by Jacques Benveniste, a French immunologist, who published a landmark paper in Nature, a very prestigious journal, back in 1988, in which he performed research. It was at the French equivalent of the National Institutes of Health, and he was head of immunology there. He had a very distinguished position. And he not only performed this experiment, this study, but scientists in 3 other countries, in Canada, Israel, and one other, replicated it. And so it was a 4-nation study because it was so mind-blowing. And Nature published it with reservations. It was John Maddox was the editor in those years. I remember the story very well. This is the gist of the study. He took a solution of antibodies, which are immune-reactive species, and he diluted them 1 to 10, and then he diluted that 1 to 10. And so you can make something incredibly dilute so that you, in essence, at the final dilution, have no more of the original starting solute molecules. And that's called going beyond Avogadro's limit. Because at that point you have no more antibodies present, and yet he found taking the most dilute solution beyond the Avogadro's limit still showed activity on these cells called basophils, which are a type of white blood cell that releases histamine when activated by antibodies, and that's the immune response. That's the allergic response, in fact. And yes, histamine was released in this assay, yet no antibodies that they could measure were present. And they calculated there should be no antibodies. So it also requires a process called succussion, which means the sequential dilution with shaking, vigorous shaking. This is also used in preparing homeopathic remedies. So dilution and then vigorous shaking and pounding the solution even on a table, or they have mechanical arms that do this now. And that succussion process seemed to be required for this phenomenon, which was, again, mysterious. Well, just to make a long story short, Nature published this paper with an editorial comment with reservations, and afterwards sent a team of investigators, hardly investigators we would know, including John Maddox, James Randi, a magician, Walter Stewart from the NIH. They marched, and Jacques Randi said, sure, come in, replicate it. And they were able to replicate it, not all of the time. And because of that, they said, it wasn't a robust phenomena, probably didn't exist, probably was a fluke. As Jacques Randi was joking, maybe it's due to the perfume of his research assistant, Everybody was looking for an excuse to dismiss it because, of course, it challenges the dose-response view of big pharmaceutical companies and ordinary biology and medicine. That the larger the dose, the larger the response. They were getting very large responses at incredibly low doses, as we understand it. So now we have to consider homeopathy because water was essential in its formation, and this was done a long time ago. 1755 was the birth time of Samuel Hahnemann in Germany, and he brought this to the United States in the 19th century, and it became the major medical system. Indeed, if you go to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and to the Civil War Museum, you will look at the medical bags that served our men and women in the Civil War. They were all homeopathic. This was the medical system of the United States up until about 1910, when a report involving evaluating and trying to standardize medical education came out by Dr. Flexner, known as the Flexner Report. This is the most significant report that turned and twisted American medicine toward the pharmaceutical era. And we essentially lost homeopathy. It was phased out. And pharmaceutical medicine, with its large doses and its dose-response law, came in. But homeopathy worked on a very different principle. Rather than suppressing symptoms like allopathic conventional medicine does today, you treat with like. In other words, if you have a head cold, you might take homeopathic onion because your nose is running, and onions make your nose run too. And that's informing the body that yes, there's an imbalance here in the nasal secretions, and work toward the body then sets into motion a self-healing mechanism, now informed in a stronger way about the imbalance. That's the idea. Another common one is use of arnica. I once, in an airport, someone hit me with a luggage cart right in the ankle and almost ruined my vacation. My ankle was now bruising and swelling up, and I was screaming with pain. But reached quickly into my homeopathic little emergency kit, which was handy in my backpack, took a dose of arnica montana, and presto, within 15 minutes, the swelling and bruising went away, and my ankle felt reasonable. And so that's incredibly quick energy medicine that comes in little vials. But it's all based on serial dilution, mostly in water, and the succussion is pounding and seemingly imprinting the water with some signature of the homeopathic substance is critical. And that process is called potentization. And what's phenomenal about homeopathy is the most dilute. The more you dilute it, even well beyond Avogadro's limit, the more potency it's said to have in therapy. So you wouldn't give those very high dilutions except under dire circumstances. And then you would give them, and they would have enormously strong responses. So there they are, and they're often sold over the counter. Nowadays, we don't have that many trained homeopaths anymore in the United States. But I think that's changing. There was a turnaround in the late 20th century when homeopathy was growing. A lot of people, though, still use it to self-medicate with combination homeopathics, and that's not as efficient or as proven as the single remedy, which you have to get exactly the right remedy. It's sort of like getting the right frequency, and then there's a tremendous response. So let's talk about the science of water underlying some of these things, like memory of water. This is a cartoon that sort of looks like a Mickey Mouse head of the water molecule. It's got a very good oxygen atom and hydrogens as the ears. And so this is a highly electronegative atom, and the hydrogen is highly electropositive. It's called a dipole. Part of the water molecule is more positive at this end and more negative at this end. And because of that dipolar nature and the sort of shape of the water molecule, a phenomenon called hydrogen bonding exists, whereby hydrogens then become shared in loose bonds between water molecules. Loose associations called hydrogen bonds, which can be made and broken easily. But this is really the essence of what holds biomolecules together. Without hydrogen bonding, DNA would not be a double helix. Proteins wouldn't function. Enzymes, as we know them, wouldn't have activity. It's critical, absolutely critical to everything in life. And water then tends to aggregate in a way. So liquid water has a much higher viscosity and that it might for its molecular weight. There are many weird properties of water that, because of hydrogen bonding, for example, the fact that ice floats is an anomaly. Most solids are denser than liquids and should settle. But if ice didn't float, then ponds would freeze from the bottom up and life would die in winter. But because ponds and lakes freeze from the top down, then life is in the warmer part at the bottom and can be preserved. So there's just an amazing, seemingly coincidence that water has properties that nourish life on Earth in so many ways. Now, liquid water may actually not be just H2O, but H2O to some value N. In other words, maybe 5 molecules of water are hydrogen bonded in certain ways. And these are not rigid, they're more flickering clusters, is how they're viewed. And so they can take many geometries, even very complex ones. Now, the interesting thing is that water sitting around, like in this bottle up here that hasn't been stirred or poured, would be in larger clusters than water that's moving in a stream. Because water with larger clusters would be lower energy. So breaking up the large clusters of water takes energy. And that's one way in which energy can change water. But there's a lot more specificity to it. The late Rustin Roy, who was a very famous material scientist from Penn State in Pennsylvania, wrote this paper together with Iris Bell and others on the heterogeneous nanostructure of water. And that's very reminiscent of the structure of life. I think it was Schrödinger who called life organized heterogeneity. In other words, there's some level of incredible complexity and heterogeneous aspects, but it's organized. In the same way, the nanostructure of water, if you were to look at the ultrastructure, you can see big hydrogen-bonded flickering clusters as well as small ones, and everything in between. So already the structure of life is set down in the patterns of these flickering clusters within water itself. Now, how do we view water with memory? I see several ways. Rustin Roy talked about epitaxy. That's from material science, where if you have two materials brought together or a surface and you crystallize something on that surface, it's informed by the material in which it sits, and it actually will conform somehow or get information from that surface. And that may be also what's going on in homeopathy. You know, you bring in solutes, molecules, say, of arnica, the water is touching, feeling, and informed by them. And maybe the types of nanostructures, clusters within water are conforming to that molecule of arnica. But those clusters are not stable, so there's got to be something more going on. Another aspect is electromagnetic frequencies. People imbue water. For example, I did some studies where I took water and put it in the presence of a Schumann resonant frequency of 7.83 hertz, and then we found it had interesting properties as a drinking water, changing some of that blood congestion that I showed you earlier. There's also been demonstrations of shifting water with human intent, with prayer and blessing. Of course, that is a long tradition on Earth. People bless their food and their water, and in religious ceremonies as well. And subtle energies, whether these are coming from healers' bodies or energies from devices, purported devices making energy that can shift them, as we heard from Dr. Tilley yesterday, shifting the pH of water via his intent-imbued electronic devices. So energy is not just a mechanical thing. When I went to school, it was just the ability to do work. That was a simple definition of energy. And there were 4 types of energy related to the 4 force fields, and that was it, folks. The strong force, the weak nuclear force, electricity, magnetism, and gravity. That was it. And there was no talk of energy holding information, but those were mechanical concepts of energy that were taught in school. And we still have a conventional biology and medicine that's founded on these mechanistic concepts of energy. So they're not readily going to embrace the concept of energy medicine or energy with informational medicine because they don't understand how energy can hold information. Fritz Popp coined the term electromagnetic bioinformation and wrote a book by that subject on that very title in 1989. And he believed that, and found evidence for in his studies, that fields coming out of organisms, so-called biophotons, contain information. They're also coherent. And I've started measuring biophotons, not just from individuals, but also looking at the therapeutic partnership. We've built, just recently, a dark chamber where 3 people can go, and we can look at the interaction between people, especially in the therapeutic partnership, because I'm very excited to understand more about energy healing and the energetic information exchanges between the healer and the patient. Now, I want to talk about some recent discoveries just in the last few years that are really exciting to me, that show the memory of water, but really may launch a whole new era in biology and medicine. And that's the research by Dr. Luc Montagnier, who's a French Nobel laureate, and very famous because he was co-discoverer of HIV, which is the virus that people think underlies AIDS. And I've met him and spoke with him and read his papers, so I have kind of a bird's eye view of this. First of all, he actually carried on in the footsteps of Jacques Benveniste. Luc Montagnier, he's an elderly man, he's now about 78, and he, I guess, was intrigued by Benveniste's work. He had a long, distinguished career as a conventional researcher in virology, immunology, etc. And then he began to take the setup of Benveniste. Benveniste also worked with some copper coils and signals and claimed he could amplify some of these effects that he saw that related to energy and information in water. So here's what he did back in 1999. He showed a wave aspect of life. This is very, very shocking. He filtered a culture of lymphocytes that had been infected with a bacteria, one of the tiniest bacteria that we know of, called mycoplasma. In fact, Luc Montagnier contributed to the HIV/AIDS picture. The mycoplasma bacteria was also one of the cofactors involved in AIDS. That didn't catch on in the United States very well, but he thinks that AIDS is not a simple HIV infection, but that has multiple hits, and that mycoplasma infection might be part of it. So naturally, he was already working with this system for many years. So he took lymphocytes, of course, get infected with these microbes. They're very small microbes, 300 nanometer diameter cells. That's really tiny. And he filtered the culture using 100 nanometer pore filters, so there were no cells possible. And the filter was sterile, and they found treating other lymphocyte cultures that never saw mycoplasma with that filtrate suddenly became infected with mycoplasma, and that was mysterious. And it seemed as though life could be carried on something other than a particle. This was published in 2009. But he went beyond this, and his latest studies are really, really wild. Okay, this is showing... let me continue with the bacterial experiment first. Okay, so then he investigated this further. He took the filtrates, and he did homeopathic dilution and succussion. So again, he went beyond any Avogadro's limit, and in the final stage. And he took this highly diluted and succussed filtrate, he placed it in a copper coil, the same coil that Benveniste used in some of his experiments. And the coil serves as an antenna for electromagnetic field signatures, or signals. And then you need a signal amplifier because these signals are so small. And then you need computer software to separate the noise from the signal, because there is some noise. And then use something called Fourier analysis to break it down to its component frequencies to find out what they are. And they found frequencies near about 1,000 hertz and multiples thereof. So they actually found an electromagnetic signature that they believe is conveying the mycoplasma information to lymphocytes and then infecting them. So this is life as wave. Now, I was taught cells only come from other cells. This is the dogma of biology. That, it's impossible that life can come out of waves and then become a particle over here. But this is really showing the quantum mechanical aspect of life, fundamentally. And he went further, and he did subsequent studies. He found evidence for DNA waves. Yes. So DNA, on the one hand, is a double helical particle that is well known. But on the other hand, he created DNA waves that transmitted information. And here's what he did. So he took ultra-dilute water solutions of DNA. He took a particular segment of DNA that was small. He didn't start with the whole gene or whole organism's DNA, but just a small sequence that was well characterized. I think it was from some virus. And again, compared the dilutions, 1 to 10, 1 to 10, down beyond Avogadro limit, and found, again, these were succussed, just like homeopathy. Only the succussion makes this work. And then they found ways that affect pure water and communicate its DNA sequence. Now that goes well beyond just some simple memory of an antibody. The sequence of DNA is a lot of information, as is the property of life itself. It just shows you the enormous memory capacity of water. Let me tell you the details of this experiment. So it's transducing DNA from the double helical particle that we're all familiar with to DNA waves, communicating the waves, and then restoring the structure in another solution. So he started by dissolving a well-known sequence of DNA, a little snippet of DNA in water, solution 1. And then his theory is that the DNA induces specific water nanostructures. He calls them nanions. Some flickering cluster that somehow relates to that shape, form, sequence of DNA in that solution. Again, this is produced with dilution and succussion of that water. These nanions, he believes, carry the DNA sequence information and convey it to another water sample. Again, it's a completely sealed test tube at some distance from the first test tube containing the DNA that was succussed, diluted, etc. But he needs to have a carrier wave. And he uses 7 hertz. I'll explain in a moment what that is. So that is a wave that they're now in a chamber where 7 hertz is generated, and that seems to be essential. 7 hertz is close to that Schumann resonance, the natural resonant frequency of Earth, the basic frequency being 7.83. What is Schumann resonance? It's bouncing around in the ionosphere, between the ionosphere and the surface of the Earth, because of lightning storms happening all the time. It's kind of a pumped up system, and that's the resonant frequency of energy bouncing between the ionosphere and the surface of the Earth. That's its ground state. Then there's 13 hertz and 39 hertz. There's lesser frequencies as well. So the 7 hertz, he didn't try other frequencies, he just decided 7 hertz because Jacques Baptiste had been working with 7 hertz as well. What's amazing is then he had DNA polymerase. What is that? That's an enzyme that can synthesize DNA from components, from the base pairs, adenine, guanosine, cytosine, thymine. So he had DNA polymerase and the base pairs of DNA in the second test tube, the building blocks of DNA, and just pure water. And as the signal came from the one test tube, apparently carried by the 7 hertz wave, suddenly DNA polymerase was able to and made DNA. It made DNA in the same pattern, the same sequence, containing the same information as DNA in test tube number 1. So that's called DNA replication, but they're not in the same solution. It's not like something in vivo. Now let me just give you a diagram, a schematic of that. So he started with some dilution and succussed DNA, He put it inside a chamber. This is mu metal. Mu metal it is a shield for magnetic fields. And there's a solid, and he had a generator making 7 hertz and a coil, copper coil. So here's the DNA, very dilute, homeopathically succussed, and here's the pure water, 2-2. And then the 7 hertz goes on for some 18 hours, this imprinting of test tube number 2. And in test tube number 2 is also DNA polymerase and the base pairs. And then the DNA polymerase goes to work and makes exactly the same DNA that was here. That's the experiment. These test tubes are always capped and closed, and there's no way to transfer the DNA molecules. So this is DNA as wave. And now we have life as wave and DNA as wave. Really dramatic. So it also shows that components of life, like DNA polymerase, which is something in our bodies and in all organisms, they have to make DNA if they make new cells. DNA polymerase can read electromagnetic frequencies, can read signals, and operate based on signals alone. And anions of water, that's hypothetical. We don't know, but that's Luc Montagnier's analysis. And from that, the polymerase is active and understands the signal, and it does its job. So it's not just about molecular recognition anymore. These experiments are far more groundbreaking than Luc Montagnier's discovery of HIV, some little virus that may be involved in a syndrome. These are revolutionary. Absolutely. This is the paper. You can download it for yourself. It's in an online journal, and this is the website. This is the latest paper on this subject. I'll take questions at the end if you don't mind. So it's Montagnier and other colleagues, Emilio Del Giudice, who's an Italian physicist, and Vitiello and some others working with him are doing the theory. Montagnier and some of the others are doing the research, but it's out of France, Germany, and Italy. Nanions is, again, this hypothetical term. What does he mean by that? He needs some kind of coherent structure within the water that's holding the information. And now that I've mentioned that, I want to go a little more deeply into the quantum electrodynamic model of water that Emilio Del Giudice, an Italian physicist, and the late Giuliano Preparata and other colleagues in Italy have been working on since the late 80s. And then these two research groups converged. Emilio's theoretical group and Montagnier's experimental group to try to understand this phenomenon. So this is Emilio's and colleagues' quantum field theory of water, which is exciting because it not only helps understand this phenomenon, but it helps us understand many of the anomalies of water. Nobody before this model could calculate from first principles why water had such a high boiling point and why water had such a high specific heat, etc. But this theory of water can calculate those thermodynamic properties from fundamental theory alone. And that's a big deal, because otherwise water was just sitting out there as some weird anomalous substance among all the chemicals that chemists play with. So, Emilio's idea is that water, in part, has coherent domains of this size, 70 nanometers. It's a nanostructure. And what he means by coherent domains is this. If I had a stage here full of ballerinas, all dancing pirouettes in unison, so every time they turn on one leg, they're always facing you at the same time, and that would be very beautiful. That's coherent dynamics. The water molecules are somehow engaged in some coherent dynamics like that, but not all of them are coherent. So then the stage would have other people just running around, and they would be the incoherent molecules, okay? So some are coherent and some are incoherent. And there's a sea of incoherent water molecules too. So water is partly coherent. There are these coherent domains. And the dynamically coherent oscillations of water molecules dance between excited and ground states, and they may have a metastable lifetime. We heard about that yesterday from Dr. Bill Tiller when he talked about metastable thermodynamics. This is the basis of the laser. It's the basis of coherence. that there's a ground state and an excited state, and metastability in that excited state, and then the water can be pumped up from the ground state to the excited state, and that takes energy. And that energy can be stored in the coherent domains of water, and very particular frequencies can be stored and emitted by the water. That's what this theory is about. And so it shows fundamentally that liquid water, by virtue of this coherent domain, is able to store and transmit electromagnetic information. And that information apparently is bioinformation, useful to living systems. So this was one of the papers by Amelia, Electromagnetic Biology and Medicine from 2009. But he has a lot of other papers that go back to the late 1980s. They've been working on this theory a long time. So there's actually been other researchers who've talked about coherence in biology. It always made sense to me. How do you have this integral wholeness at the level of an organism that's an integral whole? How does it happen? Especially when they're macroscopic. And Herbert Froehlich was a physicist, he's no longer with us, who talked about macroscopic quantum coherent states. And he left some interesting papers and books on that subject that we want to look at. Life is a macroscopic quantum coherent state. So, and the water, the theory of Amelia would then tie it together through these coherent domains in the water and the coherent waves of the biophotons, which are not only released in the biofield, but also dancing within the water, trapped within the living matrix of life. And so we have the biophotonics of Fritz Popp, who's measuring the biophotons coming out of the body, and I've begun that work as well, in which organisms emit what is believed to be coherent light. And only coherent light can really store information, as opposed to incoherent light, which stores a lot less information. I'll show you in a moment what coherence looks like. But Popp also found, at least in some species, the degree of coherence of these biophotons appear to be linked to health. And that's important to look at. It's not just the intensity of the emission, but other properties of the light that he investigated. So what do I mean by coherence? A coherent oscillation is a nice regular sine wave like this. It's repeating over time in cycles that are measurable and identical. Incoherence is something like this. It may have periods of partial coherence. These are coherent lengths, but then it abruptly shifts into some other rhythms. And so that's incoherence. And it is not capable of carrying a clean train of information, whereas this is a distinct signal. Now, it's interesting, this is a little bit of an aside, I'm getting away from water, but it is still physiology here. This is the heart tachygram of a woman that I measured, a yoga teacher of mine, teacher of Kripalu yoga, who practiced all the time. This is her before she did yoga, and she looks the same after she does yoga. She's in the zone. What does this mean? This is beautiful heart rate variability, rather high value, because their heart goes from some extremes of about 60 beats a minute up above to the 80s. And each of these is an inhalation and an exhalation. And she's doing the yogic breathing of about 5 to 7 breaths a minute, which is slow, sustained breathing. This is ideal. And most people don't look like this. What do most people's tachygram look like? This is coherence. Coherence in physiology, it's like the well-oiled machine. It's working minimally, can do the same, get the job done, and it feels good, and it's not stressed. And a well-oiled machine would operate in a coherent mode. But if your machine is not well functional, then you look more like this. And this is how most people's tachygrams look. This is the unregulated physiology, where irregular breathing and thoughts are pulling the physiology in one direction or another. And so that's what an Eastern practice can do for you, whether it's Qigong, meditation, or yoga, as an example, as an aside. And I just wanted to show you how important coherence is in biological regulation. At all levels, from the microscopic up to the macroscopic, up to heart and nervous system functions. So let's go on. So where is all this leading me as a researcher? Where is it leading the thought about life in biology? It's really a new quantum view of life, and it's very exciting, in which water is fundamental, and it's the water that stores and transmits electromagnetic bioinformation, and that it has both particle and wave characteristics. So we have life as particle. We're full of biomolecules. We also have evidence of life as wave, and the important signals in biology as having wave-like components, whether it's DNA or some other structure. There's a wave-like character, and now science has shown that this is the case. And this is a very big step forward to take us out of the mechanistic Newtonian paradigm of life as a bunch of biomolecules to life, to moving on to another order of life. And so I'm very excited about it. Now I want to get back to drinking water, because my time is limited. But going back to that memory about drinking water is something to be concerned about. Now you see, even though maybe succussion wasn't done, just the way water is processed in plants, you better believe it's stirred and pounded, etc. So those pharmaceutical drugs and female hormones and agrochemicals and all that stuff that's ending up in your drinking water is ending up in you and conveying signals. And I think it's having dire consequences. We're seeing feminization of young boys, sometimes growing breasts at age 9. There's very strange things going on in the bio community as well, in the animal community from these things. And we have to deal with it. Now, one of the ways in which I advocate removing and processing drinking water that I have researched and shown in my own work, besides reviewing the work of others, is using a water ionizer. And a water ionizer is a contraption like this that you hook up to your faucet, or you can plumb it under the sink. And so you see water is then diverted, it goes into this machine and comes out there when you want to drink it. And it's water made at the site, rather than water made by somebody else, stuffed into a bottle and delivered to you. Because even though they were well-intentioned, we don't know about the preservation of those frequencies, the information, and all that stuff that people blather about in functional water. I am not convinced that separated from the processor in which they made that water, how they were retaining that information, because water is now a great receptacle for everything else around us. How can we prevent it from losing its frequency signatures that they imbued it with and picking up other things? How can we deal with that? The virtue of this device is because of what's going on in the inside, which is electrolysis, a powerful electric field that's literally splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. It's a partial electrolysis that's done. And then you take water that came off the cathode. The strong electric fields will erase the memory of water. Besides, you put it through a pre-filter and you remove the contaminants before you do electrolysis. So what you end up is taking water from the cathode fraction. You can use water from the anode fraction for other purposes. For example, it's very good for skin and hair. And you can still water plants with it, at least some plants that are acid-loving. The water that's coming off the cathode is alkaline and has the capacity of antioxidant. It has what we call a high negative oxidative reductive potential. Let me say more about that. But in the literature, in brief, this water showed anti-aging and therapeutic effects. I've been drinking this water for 20 years. And originally I saw how it really cleaned the blood. That's the reason I got into it. The biological terrain that I showed you that is often so stagnant and congested clears up over time because the water is a powerful detoxifier. It's a powerful solvent, and because of the antioxidant aspect. And good hydration, the water has only tiny nanions because it's been through a big energy, a big electrolysis. And it's also been stirred, it's been moved through a machine. It's not stagnant sitting in a bottle. Drinking bottled water is akin to eating canned food in terms of energy quality. There's no question to me that should not be consumed, except, in a pinch when you're traveling. But alkaline water will neutralize acidosis. Acidosis is what we're all becoming because we emit carbon dioxide. We have carbon dioxide plus water within us is an acid, carbonic acid. And we're trying to get rid of CO2. We breathe it out. We have other metabolic acids, lactic acid, etc. The body gets acidic when you don't drink enough water. And drinking alkaline water combats any acid wastes. It also quenches free radicals and combats oxidative stress. How is that possible? Because it is rich in electrons coming off the cathode in electrolysis. It is going to neutralize those free radicals and combat what we call oxidative stress. And it's been clinically demonstrated. I have reviewed 28 papers in the literature over the last 30 years. This water was actually invented in Russia and largely explored in Japan and other Asian countries, Korea, China. I know when I've lectured in Japan, it seems like most of the audience is already drinking water from an ionizer. They're well aware of it. In the United States, almost no one has heard of it. And so here I go. And the studies, let's see, there's 28 papers that I reviewed. I published this in a proceedings of a conference on water and society in December last year. So my review is up to date. I'm going to republish it in a medical journal. And the question to ask yourself when you look at functional water, what research is underlying it? What clinical studies do they have? What basic science studies do they have? This water has a literature. Most of this work was done in Japan and Korea and some in China. Virtually none of it was done in the United States. Okay, so they found antioxidant effects and reduced oxidative stress and stimulation of an enzyme called superoxide dismutase, which is a key detoxification enzyme. It's stimulated in activity. They found in a study, actually one of these was done at the University of Texas by Professor Fernandez, they found 20 to 50% extended lifetime in mice, depending on the strain of mouse, when fed this water from birth. In worms, 100% extended lifetime. It's a good sign. Harder to do in humans, it would take some years. They look at very sick people, though. People with kidney disease. I mean, obviously something is wrong with the water processing in these people. They're on dialysis. People on dialysis and end-stage kidney disease have less complications and survive longer. So these are short-term studies, just to show you. People who are diabetics, again, it's practically epidemic in our society, had some improvement in blood sugar levels. And again, reactive oxygen species, reactive oxygen stress is a big problem for diabetics and in patients on dialysis. So bringing that down can help survival and complications in those diseases. Inhibition of cancer but only in vitro. So they showed that cancer cells were inhibited in cell culture, but normal cells were not. And they also looked for any toxicity, and they did it on pregnant animals and then followed their offspring. There was no problem with the pregnancies in the animals. The offspring actually weighed a little bit more and grew a little bit faster, all positive effects. There were no toxic effects seen from development, and also some protective effect on the liver in terms of alkaline phosphatase and other liver enzymes that show elevated values when something is wrong with the liver. So, how to erase the memory of water? Something that we should consider in our labs. We can use an ionizer, a strong electric and magnetic field put near the water will erase it. And it's possible also that blessing the water, and through intention we may, but I haven't explored that yet in experiments. I'm running out of time. The last few minutes I just wanted to show you some work with the GDB camera looking at just water droplets. One can look at materials through the GDB. Over there we have a camera that just looks at fingers. There's another type of gas discharge visualization camera that combined with a materials testing kit can study any material. And I've done a lot of studies on water. I just want to show you some pretty pictures because I don't have a lot of time. Comparing, for example, municipal tap water with mountain spring water collected at the source. Since the GDB can be battery operated, we can take it out there, on the Truckee River in Northern California, on a tributary, measure mountain water moving along where there's not a lot of cell phone towers and stuff like that. And comparing it with water from the ionizer. What did I find? Okay, so here's, for example, my laboratory in Evansville, California, in the San Francisco Bay. This is kind of a negative because it should be a spark of light, but you get the idea. That's the signature in the GDB. It can be analyzed, etc. I don't have time to show you all of that. And the mountain stream water has a much greater energetic signature seen in the GEV. So that's already interesting. What does water from an ionizer look like? Very similar to the mountain stream. I've talked to hydrologists about this. I said, tell me, what is the oxidative reductive potential of a mountain stream? Ideally, that's what we should drink. They said about minus 200 millivolts. That's exactly what the ionizers make. Minus 200 millivolts is an oxidative reductive potential, which taken into the body has enormous antioxidant effects. And antioxidants combat oxidative stress. On the one hand, we need oxygen, we breathe it. On the other hand, it's killing us softly through oxidative stress. So, by some dramatic antioxidant that can flow through your body that quickly, you can combat it, and it's anti-aging. So, what are the properties of a mountain stream and ionized water? They're both alkaline. They both have a high negative ORP, and by the way, so does freshly squeezed vegetable juice like carrots. Also, they both contain the healthful alkaline minerals, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. They seem to, again, they would have smaller nanostructures. And that would make it more absorbable as well. So hydration would be improved, and that dehydration affected aging may be gone. We don't know because that's a long-term study, but maybe that's why animals live longer. Who knows? And it shows a strong, vibrant energy signature in the GEV camera. Here's a book that says it all in the title by Rudy. And all of us in holistic health who are looking at biological terrain know very well if you do not alkalize, you will die. We are all moving toward acidosis. The diabetic is moving toward acidosis more quickly. It's a disease of aging, of accelerated aging, actually. But all of us are moving toward acidosis, and we need to fight acid. And an alkaline diet with a lot of vegetables and fruits and drinking appropriate water will keep us alive and thriving longer. So also, I found that drinking ionized water regularly over the long term reduces those rouleau formation, the aggregates, and seems to give the red blood cells back the zeta potential, so that they repel each other and don't get sticky and are able to manage peripheral circulation throughout the body. The tiniest capillaries require blood cells to shrink down, actually distort themselves to flow through those capillaries that have a smaller diameter and nourish all the cells of the body. And flowing clotting, again, early clotting is thrombosis, heart attack, stroke. It's, again, one of the major killers in the Western civilization. So, if not the world at large. So we're reducing a process called biochemical inflammation. Underlying clotting, early clotting is a problem. You don't feel it. It's a silent form of inflammation. It's an inflammatory cascade in the body by a sequence of proteins and chemicals like prostaglandins. Then the end result is clotting. But along the way, that inflammation is actually underlying every chronic degenerative disease, from cancer to cardiovascular disease to autoimmunity to autoimmune arthritis, you name it. All of those diseases are marked by a deep inflammatory process, and nipping inflammation in the bud is very important to longevity and wellness. So you can take your blood from this congested profile back to this normal profile by eating more appropriate foods as well as drinking healthy water and avoiding electromagnetic stress too, all those things. So, final thing I want to say, effects of intent and subtle energies in water using the GEV camera. I've done a fair amount of studies on this. I just want to show you some quick photos that subtle energy practices such as Reiki, energy healing, can enhance the image of light, induced light emission as we see in the GEV camera coming from a drop of water. That was just commercial bottled water. Here's another one treated with 24 hours with Schumann resonant frequency via a coil and wide lab, and it made a more perfect circle of light, which is interesting. Less fractality. This was my best case. Tap water compared to tap water imbued with love. It's a really dramatic shift. And I've done some workshops on this. Maybe it'd be fun to do one here sometime. Society of Anthropology of Consciousness and the International Society for the Study of Cell Energy and Energy Medicine I call them water blessing workshops. So people came, and as a group, we tried to imbue water with different emotions or thoughts, including even water's higher self, whatever that is. Viewing it with love and intent to heal, and looking at changes in the GDV. And we did observe those changes. And people even later blinded were able to taste the differences in the water and tell me which one had which signature. I was very impressed. In one workshop I did. And we always ended trying to change water energetically into wine. And actually noticing a similarity between GDV of white wine and water. So, I did some studies on distant healing effects on water from meditation groups. Actually, one of them was around here, and my lab is up north, so certainly well over 500 miles. And this was blinded, where I had water. I took water from my fish tanks because I consider that more vital to start with. And I had 2 different sites in my lab, A and B, and the distant healing group chose a site. They tossed a coin, or by random numbers they selected a site. We were blinded as to which site they were going to treat, and the other was the control water. And then we took GDV photos of the water and compared them quantitatively over time, and found about 6 out of 8 experiments showed stronger energetic signatures when we were indeed measuring the water that they had treated, following applied intent. And we were sending water again with a healing intention. So I don't have time, there's a little bit of raw data, pre and post, but I don't have time to go into the data. Okay, thank you. I'm almost done. I comb the literature for studies looking at the influence of water by subtle energies. This was the only study that I could really find that was published and robust. This was a study done in Brazil, and I don't know these researchers, but it's published in this Brazilian journal in English. They used guinea pigs, and they gave them water. First of all, guinea pigs were wounded. They had skin wounds. I think they were deliberately made wounded. Then they were given water that was treated with therapeutic touch, and 10 others were given control water. This is drinking water. And at 20 days, all of the therapeutic touch water treated group completely healed, and only 40% of the control group healed. So it showed that therapeutic touch treated water facilitated faster healing of wounds in an experimental study, which is interesting. One final thing I should say is microwaving water. A lot of people put water in a microwave to heat it for a cup of tea or coffee, and I strongly advise against this. Here's an experiment you can do at home. I'm not doing any in-house demos, but try it for yourself. Get some alfalfa seeds, microwave some water, and then as your control water, just boil some other water over the stove and cool it. Cool both waters to room temperature. And then hydrate your seeds overnight in those 2 waters, and follow their germination, follow their growth. And you will see for yourself that water that has been microwaved does not support life very well. Those seeds do not germinate very quickly, and they do not grow well. You will see that for yourself. And that's a true test of a water. And, we looked at the ionized water, and indeed it grew, sprouted seeds a little faster, and the sprouts were more robust. There was a larger dry rate at the time when we terminated the experiment. So, greater biological mass, there's a sign of more growth, more vigor, etc. And I know that the ionized water has been used in agriculture. The Japanese that I've talked to have used it over there, and that's very exciting. So, in the end, we have water is really the great mother of life. And we've learned that water can also receive and transmit the energy with information. And that it seems pivotal for the life of this wave and the DNA of this wave as we understand them today. It has a central role in this bioinformational process. And it's really a new revolution in the life sciences I think will be launched based on the work of Montagnier and others. And I'm very excited to be alive right now and contributing toward it. So, finally I want to say water and the miraculous. I am quite excited about the notion of blessed water. And it's interesting that John of God and some of the spiritist healers in Brazil often give the same water, the same herb to everybody, no matter what their problem is, and they get well. So it may not be so much about specificity as it is about intention. I have a couple of publications that discuss some of these things. One is the power of magnetized water in Dr. Emma Bragdon's new book, Spiritism and Mental Health. That's about healing treated water. And studies and observations on the health effects of drinking ionized alkaline water, review in the medical literature. It was the proceedings of this conference, and it will be in a medical journal shortly. So that's about it. You have my contact information, and blessings to all of you.